In this lesson, we'll discuss how to build modal user interfaces in iOS. In an earlier lesson, we created the show preferences method, but are currently just logging a message to the console. Let's see how we can build a real implementation for this method. I'll highlight the iMusic group and type Command-N. This will bring up the new file template chooser. I'll select Objective-C class and click Next. And I'm going to give this the name Preferences View Controller. We want it to be a subclass of UI View Controller. And this time we will check the with XIB for user interface checkbox. Click Next. And make sure both the iMusic and iMusic tests targets are checked. I'll click Create. So this created three files, a preferencesviewcontroller.h and .m file, as well as a preferencesviewcontroller.xib. Now the default name it gave to the nib file has the word controller in it, but since this is really the view, I like to take this word out of there. So let's build our preferences user interface. The first thing I want to add is a navigation bar. So select that and drag and drop that into my UI. And you'll notice as you move this around, it nicely snaps into place. And I can double click the title to give this a title. I'd also like to add what's called a bar button item. So I'll drag and drop that into the right hand corner of this. Double click this to give it a name and I'll call this Done. A Done button in iOS generally has a slightly different style, so let me switch to the Attributes Inspector. And under the Style drop-down, I will select Done. And you can see that's now a bright blue color. So I'll save this and switch over to the main view controller. So in the show preferences method, I'm going to want to create an instance of this and then present it modally. Before I can do that, I first need to import its header file. And let me create an instance. We'll just define this as an ID type since I don't care about the particular type here. Let me shrink down this window a little bit. And just like I did in the app delegate, I want to call it a knitWithNibName method. And we'll pass in a string for the preferences view and specify nil for the bundle. UI View Controller defines a method that allows us to present modal view controllers. So we can call present view controller. This is actually a new method in iOS 5. Previously, if you wanted to present a modal view controller, you would use this present modal view controller method. But they've added this new method that's a little bit more flexible. So I'll select that and pass the controller for my first argument. And for the animated argument, this just indicates that we want to present this in an animated fashion, so I will say yes. Now the last argument is what's called a block, and we'll talk more about blocks as we go along. But for right now, you can think of a block as an inline function. This is just a little block of code that we want to execute when this transition completes. In this particular case, I'm not interested in performing any additional actions, so I'll just pass a value of null. I'll save this and type Command R to run the app. I can tap the Preferences button, and this brings up our new view controller in a modal presentation. This can be a nice user experience if you want to alert the user that you've switched contexts, at least on a temporary basis, allow them to take some action, and then complete and switch back to their previous context. We can't yet tap the Done button, as we haven't hooked this up to any code yet, so let's do that right now. I'll type Command Q to quit the simulator, and switch back to the Preferences view. I'll collapse this down, slide this over a little bit, and open up the Assistant Editor. And we can hook up this Done button in a manner similar to what we did with the main view controller's buttons. So I'll hold down the Control key, and click and drag into my interface file. Select a connection type of action, and the method I want to create is called Dismiss Preferences. Click the Connect button. So this stubbed out my Dismiss Preferences method. I'll switch over to Preferences View Controller and just the standard editor. Similar to the method we have to present a modal view controller, UI View Controller also defines a way to dismiss a view controller. So I'll select Dismiss View Controller Animated, pass in yes, and once again for our completion block we'll just pass a value of null. I'll type Command R again to run the app. Tap Preferences, so that brings up our Modal View Controller. Now, tapping the Done button should dismiss it, and it does. One last thing I want to look at before completing this chapter is to discuss something that we talked about in a previous lesson, and that has to do with these view appearance methods. I will implement the view will appear and view will disappear methods, just so we can see how these get invoked when you're working with a Modal View Controller. Whenever you override these methods, usually the first thing you should do is call the superclass version of that method. In these cases, I will just print a logging message. I will do the same thing down here as well. Type Command R to run the app. And we can see that right away the view will appear method is getting invoked. So the first time this is presented on screen, this will get called. If I tap the Preferences button, you'll notice its view will disappear method is being invoked. And then when I click Done, you see the view will appear method is getting called again. You may want to try implementing these additional appearance-related callbacks that we discussed in an earlier lesson and just get a better sense for how they work. You now know how to present Modal View Controllers in iOS. Modal interfaces can be a great way to alert the user to a context switch, allow them to perform some action, and then switch back to their previous context when they've finished.